What if your home wasn't just a shelter but a trap? A place where the walls whispered your secrets, where unseen eyes watched your every move. The Sallie House in Atchison, Kansas, is infamous for being one of the most haunted houses in America. But here's the chilling truth. What you've heard about this place is only the surface. The real story is darker, more terrifying, and steeped in secrets no one dares to share. It all begins with a legend. Picture this. The mid-1800s, a stormy night. A desperate mother pounds on the door of Dr. Charles Finney's house, clutching her 6-year-old daughter. The girl, pale and writhing in pain, is in critical condition. Dr. Finney determines it's her appendix, about to rupture, and without delay, he carries her to his basement operating room. Time is not on their side. In his haste, he administers the wrong dose of anesthesia. The girl, wide-eyed with fear, screams in agony as he begins the surgery. Moments later, she dies on his table, her cries echoing in the small, cold room. But here's the twist. Historians can't confirm any of this. There's no evidence of a girl named Sallie, no record of her death in that house. Yet, decade after decade, residents and visitors recount spine-chilling encounters, sounds of children laughing, toys moving on their own, and shadowy figures lurking in the corners. What's more unsettling is that the house doesn't just haunt, it attacks. One family, the Pickmans, learned this the hard way. When Tony and Deborah Pickman moved into the house in the early 1990s, they were expecting their first child. What they didn't expect was to share their home with something else. At first it was small things, lights flickering, strange noises. Then, the baby's toys began moving on their own. Deborah would carefully place stuffed animals back on the shelf, only to find them on the nursery floor moments later, arranged in a perfect circle. The lights would turn on and off, seemingly by themselves. And always, there was an eerie, suffocating presence, as if someone or something was watching them. But this was just the beginning. What started as harmless pranks escalated into something sinister. Tony began waking up with deep scratches on his body. At times, he'd feel cold, invisible hands pressed against him. Once, he swore he saw a little girl in old-fashioned clothes standing at the top of the basement stairs. She looked terrified, her translucent figure trembling, before vanishing into thin air. The Sallie House doesn't just frighten, it digs deep into your mind, twisting your reality. Tony, a man with no history of violent tendencies, began having dark thoughts, impulses to harm his wife, Deborah. He'd wake from nightmares drenched in sweat, clutching the sheets, his mind racing with visions of terror. "It's not me," he'd mutter. "It's the house." So, what is the Sallie House? A haunted home? A gateway to another realm? Or is it something even worse? Something that feeds on fear, thrives on your darkest secrets, and leaves you questioning your own sanity? If you think this is just the beginning of the terror, you're right. Stay with us as we unravel the most terrifying accounts of the Sallie House and uncover the truth behind its deadly allure. And if you want more spine-chilling stories like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we'll keep the darkness at bay, or maybe, just maybe, invite it in. When Tony and Deborah Pickman moved into the Sallie House, they thought it was the start of a beautiful chapter in their lives. Expecting their first child, the couple was excited to settle into the charming home on 508 North 2nd Street in Atchison, Kansas. But what they didn't know was that this house was about to become a waking nightmare. At first, the house seemed perfect. Bright sunlight poured through the windows, and the neighborhood was quiet and welcoming. But within weeks, strange things began to happen. Lights would flicker without explanation, and the chains on the ceiling fans would swing as if someone had flicked them, even when the fans were off. At night, faint noises echoed through the halls, soft whispers, distant thuds. Tony and Deborah brushed it off, chalking it up to the quirks of an old house. That is, until the nursery began to change everything. The nursery, prepared lovingly for their unborn child, quickly became the center of the activity. The baby's stuffed animals would appear in strange places, sometimes arranged in eerie patterns. Deborah would walk into the room to find the toys sitting in a perfect circle on the floor, even though she'd just placed them neatly on the shelves. One night, as Tony passed the nursery, he noticed the light was on. Confused, he stepped inside and turned it off. But before he even reached the bottom of the stairs, the light flickered back on. When he returned to the room, the toys were once again on the floor, arranged as if someone or something had been playing with them. Their dog began behaving strangely as well, barking at empty corners of the nursery, its tail tucked between its legs. It refused to enter the room, standing guard at the door as if protecting the family from whatever lingered inside. What had started as a few oddities now felt like something more, something deliberate. Then came the footsteps. At night, Tony would hear the sound of running, soft, quick, like a child darting up and down the stairs. At first, he thought it was their cats. But when he checked, the stairs were empty, eerily quiet. One night, as he stood at the top of the stairwell, he felt a rush of cold air sweep through him. And then he heard it laughter. High-pitched, childlike, but somehow wrong. It echoed faintly, fading into the darkness below. The incidents grew more personal, more invasive. One afternoon, Tony lay on the couch for a nap. He suddenly sat up, his eyes glassy and unfocused, and muttered in a low voice, "He's mine." Then he collapsed back into sleep, leaving Deborah stunned and shaken. She convinced herself it was just a dream, but deep down, she knew something was off. More unsettling events began to plague them. Family photos on the walls were found flipped upside down. A candle, still wrapped in its plastic, melted completely as if exposed to intense heat. But the wick was untouched. The wax bore the imprint of a small hand, as if a child had pressed into it. Deborah's sister, visiting to help with the baby, reported hearing whispers coming from the nursery. "It's just the house settling," Deborah said. But they all knew better. The breaking point came when Tony saw her, the girl. One morning, after returning home from a night shift, he poured himself a glass of juice and turned toward the basement door. There she was, standing motionless, her frail body clad in an old-fashioned white dress. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, Tony froze, unable to process what he was seeing. And then, as quickly as she appeared, she was gone, fading into the shadows of the basement stairs. Tony sketched her image later, her haunting presence etched in his memory. When a former resident of the house saw the drawing, they gasped. "That's Sallie," they said. "She was my imaginary friend when I lived here as a child." The question haunted the Pickmans. Was this little girl a benevolent spirit, seeking attention? Or was she something far darker? Every haunting begins with a story. The Sallie House, with its eerie reputation, is no exception. Nestled in the quiet town of Atchison, Kansas, this unassuming home has a dark history shrouded in whispers and shadows. But how did this ordinary house earn its title as one of the most haunted locations in America? To understand the mystery, we must go back, far back, to a time when the foundation of this house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a breeding ground for secrets. The story often told as the origin of the haunting begins with Dr. Charles Finney, a well-respected physician in the mid-1800s. According to legend, one stormy night, a desperate woman arrived at his door carrying her young daughter, Sallie. The girl, clutching her stomach, was writhing in pain. Dr. Finney quickly diagnosed a ruptured appendix. Time was running out, so he rushed her to his basement operating room. But in his haste, he made a fatal mistake. The anesthesia he administered was insufficient, leaving the girl semi-conscious as he began the surgery. Her screams pierced the night air, and moments later, her fragile body went limp. Sallie was dead. It said that her spirit remained in the house, unable to rest, her agony and anger seeping into the very walls. It's a story that sends shivers down your spine, but here's the twist. There's no concrete evidence that it ever happened. Records show that Dr. Finney did live in the house, and it was indeed built in the mid-1800s. However, there's no historical proof of a young girl named Sallie dying there, or even being treated by Dr. Finney. Still, the lack of documentation hasn't stopped the legend from growing, feeding on the fears and imaginations of those who dare to investigate. The house itself has always carried an air of unease. Built during a time when families often face tragedy within their own homes, it has witnessed its share of death. Members of the Finney family passed away inside its walls over the years, as was common in the 19th century. The energy of grief and loss lingered, clinging to the structure like an invisible veil. Perhaps this is what gave rise to the hauntings. Or perhaps the truth is even darker. What makes the Sallie House truly terrifying is how its legend has evolved. The name Sallie didn't appear until decades later, when paranormal investigators and psychics began to explore the home. Some claimed to see the spirit of a young girl, desperate and angry, calling herself Sallie. Was this a figment of collective imagination? Or did the house itself create Sallie as a way to lure people in, to feed on their fear? What we do know is that the Sallie House has a way of weaving itself into the lives of those who encounter it. The history may be fragmented, the details unclear, but one thing is certain. Whatever dwells in that house is not bound by the rules of time or reality, and it has no intention of being forgotten. The first few weeks in the Sallie House were uneventful for Tony and Deborah Pickman. It was a time of joy and hope as they prepared for the arrival of their first child. The nursery was lovingly decorated, filled with stuffed animals, soft pastels, and a warmth that made the small room feel like a safe haven. But beneath the surface of their happiness, something else was stirring, watching, waiting. It started innocently enough. Lights flickered, which they attributed to faulty wiring. Chains on the ceiling fans swung slightly, as if nudged by a gentle breeze, even when the air was still. Then came the noises, soft creaks and muffled thuds in the middle of the night. "It's an old house," Deborah would say with a dismissive smile. But Tony couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He started waking up in the dead of night, his ears straining to catch the faint whispers that seemed to float just outside their bedroom door. Then came the first undeniable sign that they weren't alone. One evening, as Deborah and her sister sat downstairs chatting, Tony wandered up to the nursery. The light was on, which puzzled him, as he was sure it had been off earlier. When he stepped inside, his heart skipped a beat. 3 of the baby's stuffed animals were sitting in a perfect circle on the floor. Their button eyes stared up at him, as if mocking his disbelief. "Did you move the toys?" he called downstairs, his voice tinged with confusion. Deborah and her sister looked at each other, then back at him. "No," they answered. Tony laughed nervously, chalking it up to forgetfulness. But when he placed the toys back on the shelf, turned off the light, and went back downstairs, the light flicked on again. He rushed back up, only to find the toys back in the circle. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't his imagination, and it was only the beginning. Their dog, a loyal companion who had always been calm and friendly, began to act strangely. It would stand at the nursery door, barking furiously at nothing, its ears flat against its head. No amount of coaxing could get the dog to enter the room. The baby, still just a few months old, started waking up every night at the same time, crying uncontrollably. Deborah thought it was colic. Tony wasn't so sure. The air in the nursery felt heavy, suffocating, as though it carried a weight that no one could explain. The small disturbances escalated. Deborah's sister, staying with them for a few days, reported hearing faint voices coming from the nursery while everyone was asleep. "It's probably the neighbors," Deborah said, trying to calm her sister's nerves. But deep down, she knew the sounds were too close, too distinct. They weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the house. Late one night, as Tony lay awake, he heard a series of soft, rapid footsteps. They echoed up the stairs, growing louder, faster, until they seemed to stop right outside the bedroom door. Tony sat up, heart pounding. but the hallway was empty. Then came the laughter, a child's giggle, faint yet unmistakable. It sent chills racing down his spine. He didn't tell Deborah about the laughter. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread every time he walked past the nursery. Something was wrong with that room. Something was waiting for them. What started as small, explainable events had now spiraled into something much darker. The Sallie house was waking up, and it was far from harmless. Whatever lived there had made its presence known, and it wasn't going anywhere. The haunting in the Sallie house quickly transformed from eerie disturbances into a full-blown nightmare. For Tony and Deborah Pickman, the invisible presence in their home was no longer content with moving toys or flickering lights. It wanted more. It wanted their attention, their fear, their lives turned inside out. The nights became unbearable. Tony started waking up with scratches on his chest and arms, deep enough to sting, yet not enough to draw blood. "Did you do this to yourself in your sleep?" Deborah asked him one morning, trying to make sense of it. Tony shook his head, his face pale. "I don't think so," he whispered. But the scratches grew more frequent, appearing on his back, his legs, even his neck. Some nights, he would feel a sudden, sharp pain, as if invisible claws had just raked across his skin. Then came the visions. One night, Tony was lying on the couch, trying to rest after another sleepless night. Deborah was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she heard him scream. She rushed to find him sitting upright, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What happened?" she asked, panicked. Tony looked at her, his voice trembling. "I saw her," he said. "The little girl. She was standing at the top of the stairs, staring at me." Deborah tried to comfort him, but he couldn't shake the image. The girl was wearing an old-fashioned white dress, her eyes wide with fear. Or was it malice? Tony couldn't tell. The attacks escalated. The couple's candles, even ones that had never been lit, started to melt into strange shapes. On one particularly unnerving night, they found a small handprint embedded in the wax of a melted candle. Tiny, childlike, and impossible to explain. Family photos fell from the walls, their frames shattered. The glass sometimes cracked in peculiar patterns, almost like symbols. The air in the house grew heavier, colder, making it harder to breathe. One evening, Tony heard footsteps again, this time running up the stairs. Determined to catch whatever was causing it, he stood at the top of the stairwell, waiting. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right in front of him. Then, without warning, a freezing gust of air rushed through him, and he heard it, a child's laughter, echoing faintly, chilling him to the bone. But the most horrifying encounter came late one night. As Tony lay in bed, struggling to sleep, he saw something moving at the foot of the bed. At first, he thought it was a shadow, but it grew darker, denser, until it began to take form. It was a woman, dressed in black, her face twisted into an expression of rage. She floated closer to him, her movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Tony tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman's hand shot out, grasping for his throat. "Get out," she hissed, her voice a mix of anger and despair. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. Tony's grip on reality began to slip. He started hearing whispers in the walls, faint but persistent. "Heard her," they said. "Get her out of the way." He didn't want to believe the voices were real, but they were relentless. One morning, as Deborah walked past him, he felt an overwhelming urge to grab her arm, to push her away. He clenched his fists, fighting the impulse. "It's the house," he told himself. "It's not me." The house wasn't just haunting them, it was trying to tear them apart. Whatever lived in the Sallie house had turned its focus on Tony, and it wasn't letting go. The attacks became more frequent, more violent. And as the terror escalated, one thing became clear. The house wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. As the terror inside the Sallie house intensified, Tony and Deborah Pickman knew they couldn't face it alone. They turned to experts, hoping for answers, or, at the very least, validation that they weren't losing their minds. What followed was one of the most documented paranormal investigations in history, and what was uncovered only deepened the mystery. The first team to step into the Sallie House was from the popular TV show Sightings. At the time, Tony and Deborah's identities were kept secret, and the investigators approached the case with skepticism. Equipped with cameras, microphones, and all the latest ghost hunting technology, the crew began their work, expecting to debunk the couple's claims. But the house had other plans. It didn't take long for things to happen. Lights flickered uncontrollably. Unexplained cold spots moved through the rooms, making even the skeptics shiver. Objects shifted in front of their eyes, as if an invisible hand was at play. But the most chilling evidence came when Tony himself became the focus of the activity. As the team interviewed him, they noticed fresh scratches forming on his arms and neck in real time. Deep red marks appeared out of nowhere, some even drawing blood. "It felt like burning," Tony said, his voice trembling. The investigators, stunned by what they were witnessing, documented every moment. One camera captured a particularly disturbing sequence. As Tony stood still, a long, jagged scratch materialized on his torso, as if an unseen force was carving into his skin. It was undeniable. Something was attacking him. The team also conducted EVP, electronic voice phenomena, sessions, leaving voice recorders running in the nursery, basement, and other hotspots in the house. What they captured was bone-chilling. In the recordings, faint voices could be heard, some whispering, others laughing. One chilling clip featured a voice that sounded like a child saying, "Play with me." Another, darker voice growled, "Get out." Psychics were brought in to assess the situation. One medium, upon entering the house, immediately pointed to the top of the stairs. "There's a little girl here," she said. "She's angry and she doesn't want anyone in her space." The psychic described the girl as wearing an old-fashioned dress and said her name was Sallie. Deborah felt a strange mix of comfort and fear. Was this the spirit trying to protect their baby? Or was it something pretending to be innocent? Another psychic offered a far darker interpretation. "This isn't just a little girl," she warned. "There's something else here. It's feeding on your fear, your pain. It's using the form of a child to lower your defenses, but its intentions are anything but harmless." Tony, who had already been targeted by whatever was in the house, couldn't shake the feeling that this was the truth. As more investigators came, the house seemed to respond to their presence. The activity became increasingly aggressive, as if whatever was inside didn't appreciate being studied. During one visit, a camera crew set up equipment in the basement. Without warning, the room filled with the smell of sulfur, and the cameras shut off simultaneously. When the crew checked their gear, they found all their batteries had drained, even though they had been fully charged moments earlier. The basement, in particular, became a focal point of terror. In the back corner of the room, there was a small hole in the wall where bricks had been removed, exposing a dark, empty space. Investigators reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread near it, as though something was watching them from the void. One team recorded an EVP session in front of the hole, and the playback revealed a chilling response to their question, "Who's here with us?" The voice, deep and guttural, simply said, "Leave." Despite the overwhelming evidence, the investigations raised more questions than answers. Was the Sallie House haunted by the spirit of a young girl, or was something far more sinister at play? The growing number of EVPs, the scratches, and the violent outbursts pointed to an entity that thrived on fear and chaos. But why had it targeted Tony so relentlessly? And what did it want from the Pickmans? The investigators left the Sallie House with hours of footage and recordings, but none could definitively explain the horrors within its walls. For Tony and Deborah, the investigations were a double-edged sword. They finally had proof that something unexplainable was happening, but that proof didn't bring them peace. It only confirmed their worst fears. Whatever was haunting their home wasn't going to stop. Not until it got what it wanted. The Sallie House was no longer just a mystery or a haunting for Tony and Deborah Pickman. It was a living, breathing torment. By this point, the entity within the house had shed its subtlety. It was no longer satisfied with fleeting scratches or cold spots. It had taken hold of Tony's mind, his body, and perhaps even his soul. What they were about to discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about their home and themselves. Tony was unraveling. The once light-hearted and grounded man had become moody, withdrawn, and prone to outbursts. He confided in Deborah one night, his voice trembling, his eyes hollow. "I'm having these thoughts," he said, barely able to get the words out. "Dark thoughts. About you. About hurting you." Deborah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's not me," he added quickly. "It's the house. It's making me feel this way." The words hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. Deborah wanted to dismiss it, to tell herself it was just the stress of the situation. But the changes in Tony were undeniable. His behavior was becoming erratic. One morning, he woke up clutching a butcher's knife, his hands trembling, his breath ragged. He had no memory of getting it or why it was in his hands. Later that same day, their beloved pet cat was found dead in the kitchen, stabbed with a knife. Tony broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, swearing he had no recollection of harming the animal. "It wasn't me," he kept repeating. "I didn't do this." Deborah began to wonder if Tony was truly losing control of his mind, or if something darker was manipulating him. The house seemed to feed off his turmoil, growing stronger with each passing day. The whispers in the walls became louder, more distinct. They weren't random sounds anymore. They were words, threats, commands. Late at night, Tony would hear them urging him, over and over, "Hurt her. She's in a way." Deborah, too, began to feel the weight of the house pressing down on her. Though she hadn't experienced the physical attacks Tony had endured, the psychological toll was just as severe. She started to see shadows moving in her peripheral vision, hear faint laughter that stopped the moment she turned her head. The once warm nursery now felt like a trap, its air thick with an oppressive energy. When she walked into the room, she swore she could feel eyes on her, watching her every move. In a desperate attempt to find answers, Deborah began digging into the house's history. She uncovered stories of previous tenants who had experienced strange and violent phenomena. One family reported mysterious fires breaking out in the home, including a small blaze that had consumed part of their nursery. Another tenant claimed to have seen a dark, shadowy figure lurking near the basement. But the most unsettling discovery came when Deborah learned about the woman who had lived in the house before them. This tenant, a recluse who rarely interacted with neighbors, had reportedly been evicted after trashing the home. When the landlord inspected the property, he found something disturbing in the basement. Strange symbols drawn on the walls, including a large pentagram painted in the center of the floor. It seemed the woman had been conducting rituals, whether for protection, summoning, or something else entirely. No one could say. But whatever she had done, it had left a mark on the house, perhaps awakening something that should have stayed buried. Tony, meanwhile, was descending further into darkness. One night, he woke up screaming, thrashing in bed. "It's here," he shouted, his voice raw with fear. Deborah turned on the light to find him clutching his throat, as if someone or something was choking him. His neck bore fresh red marks, but there was no one else in the room. "It's not going to stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's going to kill me." Deborah knew they couldn't stay. The house was destroying them, piece by piece, and the longer they remained, the stronger it became. But leaving wasn't as simple as packing their bags and walking out the door. The Sallie House had a way of holding onto its victims, drawing them back even when they knew they should run. Tony confessed to her that he felt a strange pull toward the house, as though it had become a part of him. "I don't want to leave," he admitted, his voice tinged with guilt. "But I don't know why." The more they tried to understand the entity, the more questions they uncovered. Was it truly the spirit of a little girl, as some psychics claimed? Or was that just a mask, a disguise used to manipulate and deceive? The darkness within the Sallie house seemed to shift and evolve, taking on different forms, playing on their fears and vulnerabilities. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a psychological and spiritual attack, designed to break them from the inside out. As the Pickmans prepared to leave, the house seemed to fight back, its activity reaching a terrifying crescendo. Objects flew across rooms. Doors slammed with deafening force. The whispers turned to shouts, echoing through the halls. On their final night in the house, Tony saw the shadowy figure again, standing at the foot of their bed. This time it wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside it, smaller, its form blurry but unmistakable. It was the little girl. The darkness had revealed itself fully, and as the Pickmans fled the house, they couldn't help but feel that it wasn't the end. The Sallie house had taken something from them, a piece of their sanity, their safety, their very souls. And it wasn't finished yet. When Tony and Deborah Pickman finally escaped the Sallie house, they believed the worst was behind them. But the true horror of the house wasn't confined to its walls. It lingered in their minds, their nightmares, and their memories. As they began to piece together the fragments of their experience, they found themselves asking one terrifying question. What exactly had they been dealing with? Was it the ghost of a little girl? Or was it something far darker, something designed to deceive? The first step in confronting the truth was to revisit everything they thought they knew about Sallie. The name itself, they realized, was a creation. It wasn't part of the house's history until psychics and investigators introduced it during their visits. The Sallie they believed they were interacting with could have been nothing more than a clever facade, a way for the entity to mask its true nature. After all, who wouldn't let their guard down for a lost little girl? But for Tony, it had never felt right. From the beginning, the presence in the house had targeted him, tormenting him in ways that went far beyond what one might expect from a restless spirit. The scratches, the whispers, the visions, they all pointed to something malevolent, something feeding off his fear and pain. Tony often described feeling like the house was alive, like it could read his thoughts, twisting them into something sinister. It knew exactly how to get to me, he would later say. It wanted me broken, it wanted me angry, and it wanted me to turn on Deborah. As they sought closure, the Pickmans turned to paranormal experts for insight. Some argued that the Sallie house wasn't haunted by a spirit, but by a demonic entity. Unlike ghosts, which are believed to be the remnants of human souls, demons are said to be ancient, inhuman forces that manipulate and destroy. They use fear as a weapon, creating illusions to ensnare their victims. The theory made sense to Tony. The little girl, the visions, the attacks, they weren't separate events. They were a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror. But there was another, more unsettling theory. What if the house itself was the source of the evil? Some researchers believe that certain locations can act as amplifiers for negative energy, especially when they've witnessed trauma or rituals. The pentagram found in the basement, combined with the history of fires and deaths in the house, suggested that the Sallie house could have been a beacon for dark forces. Whatever was there might not have originated in the house, but it had certainly taken root, growing stronger with every new victim. Even with these explanations, the Pickmans were left with lingering doubts. The entity had followed them, appearing in their dreams and leaving Tony with a deep sense of unease. Was it truly confined to the house, or had it attached itself to them, waiting for the right moment to strike again? Despite their fear, they decided to share their story, hoping it might help others who found themselves in similar situations. But talking about it only seemed to awaken old wounds. As Tony recounted his experiences during interviews, he sometimes felt the same oppressive energy he'd felt in the house. It's still out there, he would say. It's watching, waiting. To this day, the truth about the Sallie house remains elusive. Was it the ghost of a little girl, angry and vengeful? A demonic force preying on the living? Or was it something even stranger, something beyond human understanding? What is clear is that the house thrives on its mystery. It draws people in, tempting them to uncover its secrets, only to leave them haunted by what they find. For the Pickmans, the truth wasn't a comforting resolution. It was a reminder that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. The Sallie House didn't just challenge their beliefs about the paranormal. It forced them to confront the darkest parts of themselves. And perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all. The Sallie House is more than just a haunted house. It is a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a story that refuses to end. For years, it has lured investigators, skeptics, and thrill-seekers into its depths, offering a glimpse into the unknown while holding its darkest secrets tightly under lock and key. For Tony and Deborah Pickman, it was more than a chapter in their lives. It was a scar they carry to this day, a constant reminder that some questions should never be answered. What makes the Sallie House so compelling isn't just the paranormal activity, as terrifying as it is. It's the way it forces everyone who encounters it to question their beliefs, their fears, and their own sanity. Is it haunted by a restless spirit, or is it something far older, far more cunning? Does it reflect the darkness of its past, or does it draw that darkness from the people who enter it? The truth might never be known, and perhaps that's why its story continues to haunt so many. There's something timeless about the Sallie House. Its walls have witnessed generations of families, each bringing their own joys and tragedies, each leaving something behind. For the Pickmans, what they left behind was more than just a house. They left a piece of themselves, their peace, their sense of safety, their understanding of the world. And yet, the house doesn't seem to let go. It continues to call out, beckoning to anyone willing to face its horrors. Maybe that's why it still draws so many visitors. The house whispers promises of answers, but those who enter leave with only more questions. Is it a place of supernatural terror, or a reflection of our own inner fears? Is the darkness within its walls real, or do we bring it with us when we cross the threshold? The Sallie House holds a mirror up to its visitors, and what they see often depends on what they carry inside. So, what do you believe? Is the Sallie House a window into the paranormal, or is it something we can't yet comprehend? Whatever your answer, one thing is certain. The Sallie House is more than a building. It's a story, a mystery, and like all great mysteries, it keeps pulling us back, daring us to take one more step closer to the edge. If you've been captivated by this tale and want to explore more stories like it, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are so many places like the Sallie House, places where the line between reality and the supernatural blurs, where the unknown waits for those brave enough to seek it out. But be warned, some answers come at a cost. And once you've faced the darkness, you may never look at the world the same way again.